The road off the post ran straight for 3 miles before the first turn, and I drove it slow that night with the windows cracked, because I wanted to feel the air move, and I wanted to be alone inside my own head for a little while. Behind me, the officers' club was still lit, still full, the reception winding down the way those evenings do, in small clusters of people who did not want to be the first to leave. Ahead of me, there was only the dark and the hum of the tires and the low green glow of the dashboard. My dress shoes were on the passenger seat. I had taken them off at a red light like a teenager, and I did not care. I kept hearing my brother's voice. Not the way he sounded at the end of the night, when the general walked in and the color went out of his face. The other way. The way he sounded at the beginning, loud and certain, when he looked at me across a room full of people whose respect I had spent 21 years earning, and said, without a flicker of doubt, that I did not belong there. "Take her phone," he had said, "before she wanders somewhere she shouldn't." I want to tell you how a person gets to a place where her own brother can say a thing like that in front of 200 officers, and she just hands over her phone and keeps her face still. I want to tell you what the young captain saw when he turned that phone over to log it, and why his hand started to shake, and why he set it down on the carpet like it had gone hot in his fingers. I want to tell you all of it, but to do that I have to take you back a few hours, to earlier that evening, before I knew how the night would end, when I walked into my brother's world in a plain dark dress, and made the mistake of thinking I could just be his sister for one night. I have driven a lot of roads in the dark thinking about my brother. This was the last one where it still hurt in the old way. I did not know that yet either. So let me take you back to the beginning of the evening, and let me tell it in order, the way it happened, so you can feel it turn the way I felt it turn. The officers' club sat at the top of a low rise on the old part of the post, a broad brick building with white columns that had been there since before either of us was born. Generations of soldiers had gotten married in that building and buried their friends out of it and drunk to their promotions in its bar. And the walls had that settled, waxed, institutional warmth that old military buildings get. A warmth that has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with time. I had been in 100 rooms like it on 4 continents. I knew the smell of them before I opened the door. Inside, the main hall was bright with candlelight and the particular noise of a military crowd at ease, which is a sound unlike any other. All those disciplined voices letting themselves be a little louder than usual. There were flowers on the long tables, white and dark green, the colors of the honorees' old division. Near the far doors, a color guard was folding down its detail, careful and unhurried. And along one wall, a row of framed photographs traced 40 years of a single man's career. From a thin lieutenant in jungle green to the silver-haired general the whole evening had been built to honor. I stopped in front of that wall for a moment when I came in. I always look. You can read a whole life in a row of photographs if you know how the army works, and I did. I came in through the side entrance and stood near the tall windows, letting the room settle around me. I had a glass of ginger ale that I was not really drinking, sweating in my hand. I knew almost everyone there, at least by name and rank and reputation, because that was my job, and I had spent the last year of my life learning exactly who these people were. There was the Corps Chief of Staff by the bar. There was the division commander I had briefed twice that month. There was a cluster of colonels near the photographs, and my brother was one of them, though I did not know that yet, standing with his back to me. I was wearing a simple dark evening dress, nothing that announced anything. That was a choice. When you are the executive officer to a 4-star general, you learn quickly that the quietest person in the room is often the one who has read every document that matters, and I had long since stopped needing to look like the most important woman present. There is a kind of power that comes from being underestimated on your own terms, from choosing it rather than suffering it, and I had spent years learning to like the taste of it. It was restful, being no one in particular for an evening. I did not get many evenings like that. My brother did not know I would be there. That was the small, stupid thing that started all of it. General Halverson had asked me to come. He had asked me the way he asked for most things, offhandedly in the hallway outside his office. Buttoning his coat, saying that 40 years deserved a friendly face at the back of the room and that I had earned an evening off my feet. He had said it like it was nothing. To him it was nothing. He did not know I had a brother in the officer corps at all, because I did not talk about my family at work, the same way I did not talk about my work with my family. I kept the 2 rooms of my life carefully separate, and I had done it for so long that I had forgotten how thin the wall between them really was. So I had not thought to tell Grant I would be there. Why would I? We did not talk the way that would make a thing like that come up. We exchanged texts on birthdays. We saw each other at the holidays when geography and duty allowed, which was less and less. I could not have told you the name of the post he was stationed at without checking, and I'm fairly sure he could not have told you my job at all, beyond the word he liked to use for it, which was paperwork. When he finally turned and saw me by the windows, something in him went tight. I watched it happen across the room, the way you watch weather move across a field. He was in his dress uniform, his colonel's eagles bright on his shoulders, holding a drink and holding court, and when his eyes found me, his easy host's smile flattened into something harder and more familiar. I lifted my glass an inch. A small hello, just his sister, saying hello across a room. He did not lift his. I told myself it would be fine. We were grown adults, both of us past 40, and this was a public place full of serious people, and there was nothing here for the old machinery to grind on. I even believed it for a few minutes. I found a place to stand where I could see the doors, out of long habit, and I watched the room and waited for the general and let myself, for once, just be a guest. I was wrong that it would be fine, but I did not know it yet, and for a little while, standing by the windows with a drink I was not drinking, I was almost happy. Let me tell you who I actually was that night, so you understand the size of what happened, and then I will get back to the room. My name is Adeline Sinclair. Most people who like me call me Addie. I am a colonel in the United States Army, and at the time of the reception, I had just been selected for a promotion to brigadier general, which is a thing that happens to very few officers, and which I had told almost no one in my family about, because I had learned a long time ago what it cost to hand my brother good news. I was the executive officer to General Roy Halverson, which is a plain title that hides a great deal. It means I was the person who ran the general's days, who saw everything that crossed his desk before he saw it, who knew his mind well enough to speak with his voice when he could not be in two places at once. Generals do not hand that job to people they do not trust with their lives. I had been doing it for a year, and in a month I was leaving it to take command of a brigade of my own. That night, before any of the trouble started, I had already done a full day of the job. I had been at the club since the middle of the afternoon. I had walked the seating chart with the protocol sergeant major, a woman named Deeds who ran events the way other people run air traffic control, and the two of us had moved place cards and argued gently about who could not be seated next to whom. I knew where every flag officer in that room was sitting, and why. I knew which of them had history and which of them had grudges. I had personally checked that the folded flag for the presentation was the correct one, and that the citation had no errors in it, because I had read the citation 3 times, because reading things 3 times so the general never had to be embarrassed was, in the plainest sense, my job. That is what an executive officer is, not paperwork, the nervous system of a command, the person who has already thought of the thing before you know to worry about it. That afternoon, before any of the trouble, I had spent an hour on the phone with the general's daughter, whose flight was delayed, arranging a car so she would not miss her father's last night in uniform. I had gone over the general's remarks with him twice and talked him out of a paragraph he wanted to keep, because it named a man who had died and would have undone him to say out loud, and part of my job, right down to that evening, was to keep a 4-star general from breaking down in front of the people he had commanded. I had checked the microphones and the parking and the order of the receiving line. None of that is glamorous, and none of it is what my brother meant by the word paperwork. It is closer to what a good stage manager does, or a good nurse. You hold the whole shape of an evening in your head, so that the person at the center of it can simply be present inside it. And you make yourself invisible while you do it. I was very good at being invisible. I had built a career out of it. It is a strange thing to be excellent at disappearing, and then to be punished by your own brother for having disappeared too well. 21 years before that night, I had raised my right hand and promised the country something, and I had spent every year since keeping the promise. I had commissioned as a second lieutenant at 22. I had made captain and taken a company. I had deployed more times than I like to count, to more places than I put on the version of my life I gave to strangers. I had a scar along my ribs that I never talked about, and a name I carried behind my teeth that I never said out loud at parties. I had learned, in rooms far worse than a candlelit reception, to hold my face still, because sometimes holding your face still is the only thing standing between other people in the worst day of their lives. And I had gotten very good at it. None of that showed in a dark dress with a glass of ginger ale. That was the whole point. A person who has actually carried weight does not need to carry it in her hands at a party. She sets it down, she lets her shoulders come off her ears. She lets herself, for one evening, be simply a woman by a window who has come to say thank you to an old man she admires. That is the version of me my brother looked at across the room and decided was nobody. And I understood, even in the middle of it, that he was not really looking at me at all. He was looking at the story he had been telling about me for 30 years, and the story had a woman in it who did not belong in a room like that. And when the real woman failed to match the story, it was the real woman he decided was wrong. You would have to understand our childhood to understand him, and I am not going to give you all of it, because a great deal of it is just the ordinary sadness of two children raised to compete for a fixed and inadequate amount of pride. But here is the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. Grant was the older one, 4 years ahead of me, the bright one, the one our father pointed at when he talked about the future. He was first at everything simply by being born first, and he never once in his life forgot it or let me forget it. Our father had served, briefly and without distinction, and he had turned the disappointment of his own short career into a bottomless appetite for his sons, and Grant grew up drinking that attention like water. There was not much left in the glass by the time it reached me. I do not say that to be pitied. I say it because it made Grant into a man who genuinely could not tell the difference between my succeeding and his being diminished, and a man like that will always eventually need you to be smaller. When I told the family I was going to commission, my father clapped Grant on the back, because Grant had commissioned first, and my choice was treated as a smaller echo of his. A little sister following her big brother into the family trade. When I made captain, Grant explained to our relatives at the table what a captain was, patiently, as though I were not sitting 3 feet away, as though the rank were his to interpret. When I came home from my first deployment thinner and quieter than I had left, carrying things I did not have words for yet, he asked me at dinner whether I had done any real soldiering over there or just the paperwork, and he laughed when he said it, warmly, so that any hurt I showed would become my failure of humor and not his failure of kindness. That was his particular gift, if you want to call it that. He could put a blade in you and then hand you the responsibility for bleeding. Over the years, he built a whole story about the two of us and told it so often and so pleasantly that our family came to believe it, and I think in the end, he believed it too. In the story, Grant was the real soldier, the leader of men, the one whose career had weight and heft and meaning. And I was the sister who had, in his telling, drifted into some soft, administrative corner of the army and stayed there because I could not do anything harder. He never said it cruelly. That was the maddening part, the part that took me years to understand. He said it with a smile, at holidays, to people who did not know better. She files things for the army, he would say, gesturing at me with his fork. Somewhere. And everyone would chuckle, and I would let it stand. I let it stand because the one time I tried to correct the record, at a Thanksgiving when I was a young major and still thought the truth would be enough, I had said, quietly, that my job was a little more than filing, and he had looked at me with such wounded, theatrical surprise, as if I had reached across the turkey and slapped him, that the whole table had turned to see what I had done to poor Grant. He had a way of making his own unkindness into your attack. And I decided, somewhere in the silence that followed, that the correction was not worth the war, and that I would rather be misunderstood in peace than understood in a fight. Our father died when I was a major, and Grant gave the eulogy, because of course he did. The eulogy was his by the same birthright as everything else. He stood up in that small church and talked about the family's proud tradition of service. And he talked about our father, and he talked a good deal about himself. And when at last he came to me, he said, from the pulpit, that his little sister had followed him into the army too, in her own way, and that their father had been proud of them both, in her own way. I was 3 years into command time by then. I had led soldiers in places I could not name in a church. I sat in the second pew in my dress uniform with more ribbons on my chest than my brother had on his, and I let it stand because you do not correct a eulogy, and because our father was in the box at the front of the church and the argument could not reach him anymore. That was the day I understood it was never going to change on its own. Not even death was going to move Grant off the story. If anything, death set it in stone, because now there was no one left alive who could contradict him except me, and I had agreed a long time before never to try. So I stopped auditioning. I made a decision, deliberately, the way I made decisions at work, and I have kept it for most of my adult life. I decided that if my brother was ever going to see me clearly, it would have to be his own eyes that did it, not my explaining, because a man who needs you small will not be argued into seeing you tall. I stopped sending him news. I stopped bringing up promotions. I never once mentioned the medal, or the road it came from, or the scar. I let him have the story he wanted, and I built a life so far outside of it, so far beyond the reach of that word paperwork, that the story could not touch anything that was actually mine. And I thought I had made my peace with all of it. I want you to know that I really did think so. I thought the wall between my two lives was thick enough that he could not reach through it anymore. And then he crossed a candlelit room toward me with a borrowed young captain in tow. And I found out how much of the old ache I had only buried, not healed. The buried things do not die. They just wait for a room with the right light in it. He did not come to me first. That is a detail I have turned over many times since. He went to the captain. The young officer was one of General Halverson's junior aides, a captain named Reese Mahoney, and he had been moving through the reception all evening, doing the small, invisible work that keeps an event like that running, refilling the general's water, steering senior officers toward their seats, being 29 years old and earnest and eager to do it all correctly. He still stood a little too straight, the way lieutenants and young captains do before the Army teaches them the more relaxed confidence of the field grades. Grant caught him by the elbow near the photographs and turned him, and I watched my brother lean in and say something low, and I watched the captain's face do a confused, uncomfortable thing. A small wince he tried to swallow, and then the two of them were coming toward me across the hall together. The colonel and the captain he had commandeered. Grant's voice arrived before he did. He had a carrying voice, a briefing voice, a voice built for parade fields, and he did not lower it. "That's not a guest," he said to the captain, but pitched for the nearest 3 tables. "I don't know how she got in here. Take her phone before she wanders somewhere she shouldn't and starts taking pictures of things she has no business photographing." The room did not go silent. That is not how it works in real life, and I want to be accurate with you. But a kind of attention moved through the nearest clusters of people, a turning of heads, a lowering of conversations, the way a crowd notices a change in the weather without anyone announcing it. I felt it land on my skin like a temperature drop. A colonel was making a scene, and the scene was about a woman by the windows, and people who a moment before had been laughing about golf were now watching me over the rims of their glasses. Captain Mahoney stopped in front of me. He was miserable. I could read it on him plainly, that he did not want to be the instrument of whatever this was, and that a colonel had given him an explicit instruction in front of witnesses, and that he was 29 years old and did not yet know the hard, useful truth that some instructions are meant to be quietly absorbed and never carried out. "Ma'am," he said, and then he ran out of words entirely because there is no polite phrase for what he had been sent to do. I looked past him at my brother. Grant looked back at me with an expression I knew from 30 years of family dinners, the one that said he had already decided how this was going to go, and was daring me to make it awkward for everyone by objecting. Behind him, one of his majors, a man named Vance, had drifted up with a small, anticipatory smile on his face. A man who enjoyed watching his colonel put someone in their place and wanted a good seat for it. I had a choice in that moment, and I want to be honest about the fact that I made it deliberately, with a clear head, in the 2 or 3 seconds the moment gave me. I could have ended the whole thing in one sentence. I could have told the captain exactly who I was and watched my brother's face fall and let the evening rearrange itself around his mistake right there in front of everyone. I had the rank. I had the standing. The general himself was minutes away and would have backed every word. It would have taken 10 seconds, and it would have been, by any fair measure, deserved. But it was another man's night. General Halverson had given 40 years to the Army, and this was his farewell, the last formal evening of a life of service, and I was not going to turn it into the oldest argument the Sinclair family owned, in front of everyone he had ever served with. I was his executive officer. My job that night right down to the last hour of it, was to protect his evening from anything that might spoil it, and I was not going to spoil it myself. And there was something else. Something smaller and harder to say out loud. Some tired, ancient part of me still did not want to fight my brother, even then, even after everything. Some part of me was still 8 years old and still wanted him, on some level below reason, to just once decide on his own that I was worth being proud of. You do not argue a person into that, so I did the thing I had done my whole life. I made myself small so that he could feel tall. "Of course," I said, and I unlocked my phone and handed it to the young captain, screen up, easy, unbothered. "It's fine, Captain. You're just doing what you were told. Go ahead and log it." Mahoney took it like it might go off in his hand. Grant's shoulders came down a satisfied 1/4 of an inch. He had won, and he knew it, and he half turned away to say something to Vance, already narrating the victory to his audience, the story writing itself in his favor the way his stories always did. And Captain Reese Mahoney looked down at the phone in his hand to do the small, dumb, administrative task of logging it, and that is the exact moment that everything turned. I did not see his face change because I was watching my brother, but I heard the sound he made. It was not a word. It was a small, sharp intake of breath, the sound a person makes when they miss a step in the dark and their whole body catches itself. I looked back at the captain. He was staring at the screen of my phone as though it had spoken to him. My lock screen is nothing dramatic. It is a photograph of a mountain I like and a row of the day's messages, the ordinary traffic of a job like mine, meetings and reminders, and the small, constant weather of running a general's life. But sitting at the top of that row, that night, was a message that had arrived while I stood by the window, and it was from a contact saved under a single word. And the young captain knew that word the way you know your own name, because he worked for the man it belonged to. The word was the general's call sign. The message beneath it was short. It said he was 2 minutes out, and to save him a decent chair, and to stop hiding by the windows. Captain Mahoney read it. He read the name above it. And I watched a very young officer do the fastest piece of thinking of his career, watched his face empty and then fill again with understanding, watched him realize in the space of one breath that the woman his colonel had just called a gate crasher, the woman whose phone he had just been ordered to confiscate, was the executive officer to the 4-star general this entire evening had been built around, the second most powerful person in that command. And that the general was, at that very moment, coming up the front steps expecting to find her. His hand started to shake. I saw it, the tremor traveling up from the phone into his wrist, and his face went the specific gray of a young man watching his future collapse down to a single point. And then he did the thing I will always remember him for, the thing that told me he was going to be all right in the army after all. He set the phone down. He did not hand it back to me, and he did not hand it to my brother. He crouched and set it on the carpet, face up, still lit, as though holding it 1 second longer would make him a part of what was about to happen, as though he wanted to be able to say later that the instant he understood, he had put the thing down and taken no further part in it. Then he straightened, and he looked at me, only at me, and his mouth moved, but nothing came out. A few feet away, the protocol sergeant major, Deeds, saw the captain's face. She had been running that reception like a quiet machine all night, and she had been in the army for 30 years, and she could read a room the way a preacher reads scripture. Whatever she saw in Reese Mahoney's expression made her set down the tray in her hands with great care and begin to move toward us, unhurried, the way a senior non-commissioned officer moves when she has decided a situation needs a grown-up before it needs anything else. My brother had noticed none of it. He was still half turned toward Vance, still talking, still pleased. He had no idea the ground had already moved under him. He thought the story was over, and that he had written the ending, and that the ending was in his favor, the way he had always assumed the ending would be. The phone lay on the carpet between us, face up, glowing, that one word bright on the screen for anyone who bent to look. I did not bend to look. I already knew what it said. It was Grant who broke the small silence, and he broke it in the worst possible direction, because he mistook the quiet for hesitation. And my brother had never in his life met a hesitation he did not want to push. He turned back and saw the phone on the floor and the captain frozen and me standing there calm. And instead of reading any of it correctly, he read it the way a man like him reads everything, as a challenge to his authority. His face darkened, Pick it up, he said to the captain sharply. What are you doing? I told you to hold it, not throw it on the ground. And you, he said to me, and here his voice climbed again, back up to the parade field. I already told you this isn't your event. Wait outside. Don't make this into a thing in front of everyone. Wait outside. To a room that had now, whether he could feel it or not, almost entirely stopped its own conversations to watch the colonel and the woman by the windows. Major Vance stepped in to help, because that is what men like Vance do. They smell their colonel's discomfort and rush to convert it into someone else's. He moved up beside me and put a hand in the air near my arm, not quite touching it, and said, in the reasonable and faintly apologetic tone that people use right before they do something entirely unreasonable, that perhaps it would be best if I just stepped out into the hall, ma'am, only for a moment, only until all this got sorted out. I looked down at his hand, hovering there near my arm. I did not step back and I did not step forward. I simply did not move, and after a second his hand came down on its own, because there is a particular stillness that a person cannot put their hand on. And I had learned that stillness in harder places than a reception hall. Something had shifted in me, and it had shifted quietly without heat, the way a heavy load shifts on a truck when a strap you have been ignoring finally lets go. For 30 years I had made myself smaller so my brother could feel larger. I had swallowed the corrections, and then stopped even trying to make them. I had let him tell an entire family that I pushed papers. I had, 10 minutes earlier, handed a stranger my own phone, rather than embarrass my brother at a party. I had spent a lifetime doing his emotional labor for him, carrying the whole dead weight of his refusal to see me, protecting him again and again from the consequences of his own smallness. And now I was standing in a room full of people I had served beside and served above, being told to go wait in the hallway like a scolded child. And something in me, some strap I had been ignoring for 3 decades, simply let go. I was not going to detonate him. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters to everything that came after. I was not going to spin around and pull my rank and my billet and my selection and destroy my brother in front of 200 officers. That was his kind of move, the loud kind, the public kind, the kind that leaves a permanent mark on a person so that everyone can see where you got them. I did not want to leave a mark on Grant. I had spent my life being marked by him, and I knew exactly what it did to a person to carry those, and I was not going to hand him one of his own to carry. I just wanted to stop holding the whole thing up. That was all. I had been standing under the structure my entire life, arms braced, keeping it from falling on him. And I was tired. And I was going to step out from under it and let it stand or fall on its own for once. So I stopped covering for him. I let the truth stand up by itself, without me stepping in front of it to soften it. And I said one sentence to my brother, and I said it quietly, so quietly that he had to go still to catch it. You should sit down, Grant. He blinked. It was not what he expected. There was no anger in it for him to push against, no volume for him to overpower, nothing to argue with, and it landed strangely in the space between us. For the first time all night, a flicker of real uncertainty crossed his face. Because in 30 years I had never once spoken to him from that place, the flat, calm place with no fear in it and nothing left to prove. He did not know that woman. He had never met her, because he had never once let her exist in front of him, and that was the exact moment the tall doors at the far end of the hall opened. There is a thing that happens to a room when a 4-star general walks into it, and it does not depend on anyone shouting anything. Nobody called that room to attention. It was a social evening, a farewell, not a formation, and the old customs bend for that. But a current went through the hall all the same, an unmistakable straightening, a turning, 200 trained men and women orienting on the most senior person present the way iron filings turn toward a magnet. Without deciding to, without being told. General Roy Halverson was 61 years old and looked like exactly what he was, which was a man who had spent 40 years being personally responsible for other people's sons and daughters, and had not once managed to set the weight of that down. He came in with the easy, unbothered authority of a man who no longer had to perform any of it, who had commanded so long that command had become as plain on him as the color of his eyes. His senior aide moved to fall in beside him. He waved the aide gently off. His eyes went across the room the way they always did, taking silent inventory, counting the house. And they found me by the windows, and his lined face opened into something warm and glad. And then he did the thing that ended it, and the terrible mercy of it was that he did it without the slightest idea of what he was walking into, which somehow made it land even harder than any speech could have. He came straight to me. He crossed that entire hall to do it. Past the Corps Chief of Staff, who wanted a word. Past the division commander, who half raised a hand. Past the head table, where his own seat waited. Past my brother, whom he did not know from any other colonel in the room. He crossed all of it, on his own 2 feet, at his own unhurried pace. And he came to me at the windows and put out his hand and took mine in both of his, the way an old man takes the hand of someone he is fond of, and he said, in a voice pitched without any effort for the whole room to hear, because he was pleased to see me and saw absolutely no reason to hide it. "There you are, Colonel. I have been texting you. Why on earth are you all the way over here by yourself in the corner? I saved you a seat at the head table. Come on, get up front where I can keep an eye on you. Colonel, the head table. I saved you a seat." I watched the words travel out across the room and rearrange every single face they touched on the way. I watched them reach the officers who had turned to watch a colonel scold a nobody, and I watched those faces recalculate. And I watched them reach my brother. I will not pretend to you that I felt nothing. I felt a great deal. But most of what I felt, watching Grant's face come apart, was not triumph. And I have thought about that a lot since. It was a strange, old grief, because I could see him understanding it, piece by piece, in real time, exactly what he had just done, and to whom. And I knew, even standing in the middle of my own vindication, that the understanding was not going to make him better. It was only going to make him ashamed, and shame in my brother had always come out sideways, as anger, as blame, as a new story in which he was somehow the injured party. I had watched it happen my whole life. I was watching the machinery start up again, even now. He had called me a gatecrasher. He had ordered a young captain to seize my phone. He had told me to go wait in the hall. And the woman he had done all of that to in front of everyone whose opinion he cared about was the right hand of the man whose 40 years the entire United States Army had gathered in that building to honor. And she had just been called by name to the head table while 200 people watched. General Halverson felt the strangeness in the air then. Good commanders always do. It is the whole job in the end, feeling the temperature of a room. He looked from my face to my brother's and back again, reading it, and his warm expression cooled by a small, precise degree, not into anger but into attention. Captain Mahoney bent and picked my phone up off the carpet and held it out to me with both hands, and a face full of misery and apology, and I took it and thanked him quietly by his name, and the general watched that small exchange too. The phone on the floor, the captain's shame, and I could see him beginning to assemble the outline of what he had walked into the middle of. He did not thunder. That is the thing about real authority that the movies always get wrong. It almost never has to raise its voice. The louder a man is, the less power he usually has, and the men with the most of it are often the quietest in the room. My brother was loud. General Halverson did not need to be. He turned toward Grant with perfect, unhurried courtesy, and he said, "Colonel Sinclair, is it?" Reading the name off the eagles and the bearing, and my brother said, "Yes, sir," in a voice that had lost every ounce of its earlier volume, a voice suddenly the size of a boy's. And the general said, mildly, pleasantly, that he had not realized the colonel and his executive officer were acquainted. And then he let the sentence sit there in the air between them, unhurried, giving my brother a chance. It was a small, graceful opening, a door held briefly ajar, an invitation to say something true and human, something like, "She's my sister, sir, and I have just made a terrible mistake." Grant did not take it. He could not. I do not think the words even existed for him in that moment. He stammered something about a misunderstanding, about security procedures, about not having recognized me in the crowd, and every single word made it worse. Because there is no version of the sentence "I did not recognize my own sister" that improves upon being said out loud in front of a 4-star general and 200 officers. The more he explained, the smaller he got, and I watched Vance quietly, physically detach himself from my brother's side, drifting backward into the crowd, abandoning ship the way men like Vance always do the instant the wind changes. The general's courtesy cooled by another surgical degree. He did not need the details filled in. He had 40 years of reading exactly this kind of moment, and he could see the plain shape of it without a single fact more. A senior officer who had publicly humiliated a woman he took to be beneath his notice, only to find out she was the general's own right hand. Halverson simply looked at my brother for a moment longer than was comfortable. A long, level, evaluating look, the look of a man filing something away. And then he said, evenly, that he was sure it had all been a misunderstanding, and that he hoped Colonel Sinclair would enjoy the rest of the evening. And the way he said it, the particular cool weight he put on the word, enjoy, made it clear to everyone within earshot that the conversation was over, and that something larger than the conversation was also over, something that had to do with my brother's standing in the eyes of the only kind of man whose eyes my brother had ever really cared about. Then he turned his back on Grant, gently, the way you turn away from a door you have decided to close, and he offered me his arm, an old-fashioned courtesy from an old-fashioned man, and he walked me the entire length of that hall to the head table, while 200 people watched us go. And the officers who had looked away when my brother called me a crasher now looked directly at my brother, and there was no cruelty in their looking, which is somehow worse than cruelty. It was just seeing. They were finally seeing him, and Major Vance was nowhere to be found. I did not look back at Grant. I want to tell you I was above wanting to, but that would be a lie, and I promised you the truth. I did not look back because I did not trust what my own face would do if it saw his, and because whatever was written on it, I did not need to collect it. I had spent my entire life reading my brother's face for an approval that never came, studying it the way I later learned to study terrain for signs of safe passage that were never there. I was finished reading it. I let him have his face to himself, out there behind me, and I walked toward the head table and did not turn around. At the table, General Halverson pulled out my chair himself, another courtesy from another century, and as I sat, he leaned down close and said quietly, just for me, under the noise of the room resuming, that he did not know what that had been about and did not need to, but that I had handled it a great deal better than he would have, and that whatever it was, I did not owe it one more second of my evening. I thanked him. And I discovered, sitting there in the candlelight with the flowers and the folded flag and the low, warm noise of 200 people pretending to go back to their conversations, that my hands were perfectly steady in my lap and that the thing sitting in the center of my chest was not victory at all. It was something quieter and much older, and it took me the rest of the night to find its name. They read the citation a little later, the way they always do at a retirement. 40 years of one-man service pressed down into a few careful paragraphs. A theater and a year and an act and a decoration. And I sat at the head table and listened and let my mind go where it wanted to go, which was not toward my brother at all. It went where it always goes when I am finally still enough to let it off its leash. It went to Theo Okafor. You do not know that name, and there is no earthly reason you should. He was a staff sergeant, and he was 27 years old, and he died on a road in Afghanistan in the summer of 2011 while I was his company commander, in an ambush that I got most of my people out of and could not get him out of. He had 2 little girls he used to talk about at the worst hours of the night, when talking about home was the only thing that kept any of us upright. He used to show me their drawings, folded soft from being carried. I have a scar along my ribs from the day he died, a long pale seam I have never explained to anyone who asked. And I earned a decoration for that day, the Silver Star, though I have never once in 14 years felt that the word earned was the right word for it. The arithmetic of that afternoon still does not balance for me, and I have finally stopped waiting for it to. I carried a wounded soldier the better part of 100 meters under fire, and I lived, and Theo did not, and that is the whole true story of the medal, stripped of the language they read at the ceremony. I have never told it at a party. I did not tell it that night. I have never once let it into the room where my family could get their hands on it, because I could not have survived hearing my brother reduce it. I bring it to you now, here, because sitting at that head table with my standing just restored in front of everyone, I finally found the name of the thing in my chest, and it was not victory. It was grief, and it was very old. Because the reveal had fixed the room. It had not fixed the brother. The general calling me colonel across that hall had undone the humiliation in the eyes of 200 strangers, and that mattered. I will not pretend to you that it did not matter. It mattered a great deal in the plain human way that being seen always matters. But it did not give me the one thing I had actually spent 30 years wanting, which was a brother who was proud of me on his own, quietly, at a family table, without a 4-star general in the doorway to force him into it. A vindication I had never asked for had arrived in place of a respect I could never seem to earn, and the two were not the same currency, and one could not be spent on the other. I had learned that particular lesson before, in far harder classrooms than a reception hall. You do not get to choose what your service costs you, and you do not get to choose what it earns you, and the two ledgers almost never balance against each other. I had a medal I could not feel good about, for a man I could not save, whose daughters are grown now. And now I had a public vindication I had not wanted, standing in the empty place where a private respect should have been. That is simply the shape of some lives. The costs and the earnings do not net out. You stop expecting them to, and you learn to carry both, and carrying both without going bitter is most of what dignity actually is. I thought about the last thing Theo ever said to me, which was not profound because the last things people say almost never are. He asked me if I thought the mail had come in. That was all. He wanted to know if there might be a letter from home waiting back at the base, and I told him probably, and I was right. There was one. It sat in his gear for a week before anyone could bring themselves to deal with it. I have carried that small, ordinary question for 14 years, and it is heavier than any citation they have ever read over me. It is the private weight, the kind nobody pins on your chest and nobody reads aloud at a ceremony, the kind you do not get a medal for and would trade every medal you own to set down. My brother thought my whole life was paper. He had no idea what the real weight of it was, and I had made very sure that he never would, because some things are too important to hand to a person who will only find a way to make them smaller. Grant found me near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the candles had burned down to their last inch and the folded flag had been carried away. He came up to the edge of the head table, and the certainty was gone from him now, all of it, and he stood there with his hands loose at his sides, like a man standing at a graveside who does not know what to do with his hands. "You could have just told me," he said. And there it was. One more time. Even then, even after all of it, standing in the wreckage of an evening he had wrecked entirely by himself. He had already found the version of the story in which the failure was mine. I had not told him. If only I had told him, he would not have had to humiliate me. My silence had made him do it. It was, in its awful way, a perfect and final distillation of my entire life with my brother, delivered as an apology that was somehow still an accusation. I looked at him for a long moment. I was not angry. I had gone all the way through angry years before and come out the far side into something quieter and more permanent and much harder to argue with. "I did tell you," I said. "For 30 years, Grant, I told you every single time you decided you already knew who I was, and I let it stand anyway. I have been telling you my whole life. You just decided a long time ago what the answer was, and you stopped listening for anything else." He did not have a response to that. There was not one available to him, and I found, a little to my own surprise, that I did not need him to have one. I stood up from the head table, and I gathered my shoes from where I had slipped them off under it, holding them in one hand, and I told him good night, and I meant that ordinary word far more completely than he understood in the moment. Then I walked out. I left before the last of them, which is not like me at all, because I am usually the one who stays until the room is squared away and the general is safely gone. But I had nothing more I needed from that room, and Sergeant Major Deeds caught my eye by the doors and gave me the smallest nod, which meant she had the rest of it handled, which she did. So I walked out into the warm summer dark, and I crossed the lot to my car, and I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel and my shoes on the seat beside me. And then I drove down that long straight road with the windows cracked, which is where I began telling you all this. Here is where it landed, in the days and weeks that came after. Because a night like that is not really finished when you drive away from it. Keeps happening for a while, quietly, in how you decide to live. I did not report my brother. There was nothing to report that the entire room had not already witnessed with its own eyes, and the general's cool good night had already said everything that needed saying to anyone whose opinion of Grant actually mattered to Grant. I did not need to add a single word to it. The pettiness of that evening was his to carry now, not mine to prosecute. And I have seen what it does to a person to build their peace out of another person's downfall. I did not want to build my peace out of my brother. I did not want to build anything out of him at all anymore. And that turned out to be the real change in me, the one that had been coming for 30 years. It was not that I had finally won. It was that I had finally stopped playing the game entirely, and you cannot lose a game you have walked away from. A month later, I left the general's staff, and in a small ceremony with far fewer people than my brother's reception had held, I pinned on my star and became a brigadier general, and then I went and took command of my brigade. That is a whole story of its own, and the important thing about it, the thing I hold on to, is that it has nothing to do with Grant. I built the largest and best thing of my life in a place his story about me could never reach. Among soldiers who knew exactly what I was because they watched me do it every day, and I stopped waiting for my brother to come and see it, there's a young sergeant in my brigade, a woman who reminds me a little of myself at that age, quiet and underestimated, and twice as capable as the people who overlook her. I watch how the men around her decide what she is before she has said a single word. And I make a point, when it is warranted, and only when it is warranted, of putting the hard thing in her hands in front of them, so they have to stand there and watch her do it well. I cannot give her a brother who sees her. Nobody can give anybody that. But I can give her a few rooms where being underestimated is not the end of the story, only the beginning of it. And I have decided that this is a far better use of what that reception taught me than any amount of being right at my brother would ever have been. You take the thing that was done to you, and if you are careful and a little bit stubborn, you turn it into the one thing you will never do to anyone under your own command. But I kept the door open. I need you to know that, because severance and cruelty are not the same thing, and I was determined not to become the very thing that had spent my life hurting me. Closing a door softly is different from slamming it, and it is different again from standing in the doorway, forever holding it open with your own aching arms, while the other person decides year after year whether you are worth walking through it for. I left him one voicemail a few weeks after I took command, and it was level and short. No accusation and no plea. Just my voice telling my brother that the door was open if he ever actually wanted to know me, the real me and not the paper one, and that I would always be glad to hear from him and that I would not be knocking on his door anymore. And then I let it be. I set the weight down in the road and I kept driving. He has not crossed that distance yet. He may never. I have made my genuine peace with the fact that I do not get to control that part, that I never did, that a person's willingness to finally see you is the one thing you cannot earn or force or argue into being, no matter how many medals you carry or how quietly you carry them. What I did get to control was whether I kept shrinking myself down to fit inside his idea of me, and I stopped. The day I stopped, nothing in me broke. I had been so afraid for so long that letting go of the weight would break something. It did not. I just got lighter, all at once, the way you do when you finally set down a ruck you have carried so long you forgot it was optional. So that is the whole night, from the dark road backward to the reception and then forward again into the quiet after. A young captain read one word on a phone, and his honest hand shook. A tired old general crossed a crowded room to a woman in the corner because he was fond of her and saw no reason to hide it. A brother learned, too late and in the hardest possible way, exactly who his sister had been the entire time she was standing right in front of him. And a woman who had spent her whole life making herself small finally set the weight down on the shoulder of a summer road and kept her hand steady on the wheel and drove home under her own quiet stars. If you have stayed with me all the way to here, then some of this is probably yours too, and I want to say the last part to you directly, the way the old general said my name across that room, plainly and without hiding any of it. If there are people in your life who only seem able to see you when someone important is watching, who can only find their respect for you in the doorway of a general or a boss or a crowd of the right people, then I need you to understand one thing clearly. That is not a measurement of you. It never was. It is a measurement of the room they happen to be standing in. They are not looking at your worth when they finally straighten up and pay attention. They are looking at who else is looking. The moment the important eyes leave the room, so does their respect, because it was never yours to begin with. It was on loan from the audience. You do not owe anyone the shrinking. You do not owe them the smaller, easier version of yourself that lets them feel taller by comparison. I spent 30 years doing my brother's work for him, carrying the entire dead weight of how he refused to see me, stepping in front of the truth again and again to soften it so it would not embarrass him. And the day I finally set that weight down, I did not lose a brother I had ever really had. I just stopped pretending I had him. Hand the people who cannot see you the truth, once, plainly and without heat, and then let it stand on its own 2 feet. You do not have to keep stepping in front of it forever. And if they still refuse to see you after that, then that is theirs to carry now, not yours. Let them carry it. Let them stand out there at the edge of their own event, alone, holding the story they chose over the person you actually are. Keep your hands steady. Keep the door open if you can manage it, without holding it open with your own body. And then turn the key and pull out onto the road and drive yourself home. That is the one true thing that night left me with. And now it is yours.